About 100 years ago, my great-grandfather decided that rather than take over the family farm, he was more interested in the new technology that was taking over, the automobile. He started a garage to repair the cars that were coming through the area and eventually hired my grandfather. Fast forward to today, and car repair has been in the family business for going on 4 generations. However, much like my great-grandfather, I too have decided that the family business just isn't my thing. So rather than become a car mechanic, I too am chasing the new technology, computers. I started programming when I was 12. I had long wanted to make games. I had filled folders with ideas and even mailed a few letters with ideas to Nintendo, as I'm sure many other kids have done as well. I probably would have started programming much sooner, but my family didn't get a proper computer with internet until I was 11, and I spent the next year unsure of exactly what I needed to type into Google to find the information I wanted. Of all programming languages to start with, I started out with C, a programming language that gives you very little to work with other than the most basic nuts and bolts that the computer gives you. Around the same time, a friend got me into Minecraft and I became the local consultant for everything redstone, redstone being a material in the game that can be used to build digital circuits. The combination of these, as well as some other factors, started me out with a ground-up understanding of computers. Definitely not best for the hack stuff together attitude of much of modern programming, but certainly not without its advantages. I don't doubt that there's likely some inherited affinity for working with things in my family. You don't get 4 generations of car mechanics without people whose brains are deeply focused on breaking things down into individual pieces, sometimes literally, and understanding how everything works together. Even then, I've read stories of my great-great-grandfather, the farmer, about how he always kept up with the newest technologies on his farm. Clearly, these traits go back much further than 4 generations. However, as much as I've loved working with computers, from just about day one, there's always been this struggle, this frustration. Assembling a complex system in my head is quite fun, but actually implementing it, actually writing the code is, for some reason, much harder. Harder than it feels like it should be. Looking at the compilers, IDEs, debuggers, and all these other tools, I've always had this thought in my mind that, is this it? Is this all the tools that I'm given? Something never really felt right. The computer is a black box. As much as I can understand how everything works in theory, I can't lift the hood of my program and watch the engine actually run. Before continuing, I'd like to just introduce myself and this podcast. Welcome to the first episode of the Intersecting Shadows podcast. I'm your host, Charles Rosenbauer. This podcast is supported by Badger Labs, a startup I run with my friend Will Pangman. And I'd also like to give a quick thanks to 100 State, which is a co-working space here in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm currently recording this. As for what you can expect from this podcast going forward, I'm still trying to work out exactly what the goal is beyond sharing ideas that I find particularly interesting, though perhaps underappreciated. The name of the podcast, Intersecting Shadows, is inspired by a certain geometric interpretation I've found that is common to both satisfiability problems and Bloom filters, which is a really fascinating subject I'll perhaps address in a future episode. This podcast is pretty new. If you have any feedback or possibly want to come on as a guest, you can reach out to me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Bzogrammar, spelled BZOGRAMMER. DMs are open. Thank you. Now let's get back to the episode. In my family, I happen to be the oldest of 4 siblings. Being the big brother, doing something new, I'll admit there has been a bit of evangelism on my part. Around the time I was learning to program, my younger brother Joe, being 2 years younger than me, began building his own go-karts and motorcycles from spare parts. At one point, he took a block of aluminum and, using little more than a drill press and a lathe, turned it into a fully functioning engine about the size of my thumb. Granted, it ran off pressurized air rather than any kind of fuel, but it ran nonetheless. My other two siblings are much younger than me. My little sister has decided that she wants to be a marine biologist. She's shown some interest in programming, though as of late that's been interrupted by her becoming a moody preteen who thinks it's not cool to get along with her older brother, I guess. My little brother, on the other hand, has been a bit of a toss-up. Everyone's been wondering for years if he'll go into computers or go into machines. He's tried programming, though he's found it difficult. A couple months ago, he got himself a go-kart. So far, he has replaced the engine with a more powerful one, removed the roll cage, of course he's 13 after all, and even taught himself to weld so that he could attach a front bumper. A few weeks ago, he was showing me another project of his, an experiment to see if he could attach a small motor to a bicycle, and told me that he had made up his mind. I don't want to do programming, he explained. It's too hard. Things go wrong and you have no idea why. Mechanical stuff is easier. As much as I was disappointed by his final decision, I agreed completely with his complaint. One of the advantages of having a family full of car mechanics is the free car repairs, and another is the cheap cars, even if they're often junkers. My first car was a Kia, that I could tell my dad regretted getting me. Repairing it was frustrating and frequent. The special oil it needed, rather than coming in the usual plastic bottles, came in a giant plastic bag. And these bags were extremely awkward to handle. I know because I helped him out with this a few times. Another issue, and what eventually killed the car, was that the cable that powered the spark plugs ran through the middle of the engine for some reason. This meant that the heat of the engine was slowly melting the cable, and also that replacing it would require ripping the whole engine apart. The degrading cable led to constant misfires, bad fuel efficiency, and eventually the death of the car while I was on the highway on a hot summer day, an hour and a half from home. My current car is only about 2 years younger than me, and as of a couple months ago has over 250,000 miles on the odometer. My dad's been warning me since I got it of its numerous problems, though it continues to surprise both of us by refusing to die. One day, after a routine checkup, my dad pointed out a detail about the car to me. This was something that I know I had noticed at some level, at least a subconscious level, but just how much my dad was able to deduce from what seemed to me like a minor random detail was astonishing. He pointed out that when starting the car, during the normal revving of the engine, there was this irregular clacking noise. Tick, tick, tick. He explained that during ignition, the starter, a small electric motor that is used to kickstart the main engine, the starter spins a small gear, which in turn spins a much larger gear, which is connected to the main engine. That noise is the noise of the two gears grinding together and skipping exactly 3 missing teeth. He explained that if nothing else kills the car first, several more teeth will eventually break off. If these teeth are next to each other, the small gear could get stuck with no place to grab onto the big gear, and the car would no longer start. The crazy part? He was able to figure all of this out purely by ear and from his experience. He didn't even have to look at the engine or the gears to know exactly what the problem was. To this day, I'm still shocked that so much could be gained from just a single sound, and I think it is definitely worth asking, can we do this with software? Let's take a closer look at what's going on and try to understand this. This will take us through neuroscience as well as a bit of computer science. Let's start with the computer science, though, as I'm sure that will be a bit more familiar to my audience. There's a movement in software development right now for functional programming. Functional programming is an old paradigm of programming and programming languages, which arguably has a prettier mathematical foundation than much of the rest of programming. One common goal in functional programming is to minimize, or at least isolate, side effects in your code. What this means in less technical terms is actually pretty simple. In functional programming, code is built from pure functions. A pure function is a mapping from some set of inputs to some set of outputs, and only that mapping. This is deterministic. Put the same inputs in twice and you'll get the same outputs out. It also doesn't have any side effects, meaning that it won't secretly print text to the screen, modify some distant, seemingly unrelated value somewhere else in the code, or launch the missiles. All it does is it takes inputs and produces outputs based on some set of rules. These two properties provide a great number of nice benefits that can make code easier to reason about for both humans and for the computers assisting humans. Of course, a program with no side effects is hardly useful at all. It doesn't get input from the user, read files from disk, put stuff on the screen, launch the missiles, or anything else you might want it to do. And it really can't do much. At the end of the day, the goal of the program is to have an effect, not to make the computer warm. So rather than eliminate all side effects, it's considered better to isolate them to some simple part of the program that's not too hard to reason about, and build the rest using these simple pure functions. Part of what makes pure functions so convenient is that they can serve as simple black boxes. Rather than worry about all the details of how something is calculated, you just need to know what is calculated. When you don't want to have to reason about the internal workings of a system, it's extremely useful to just brush the details under the rug, rather than having some obscure detail that isn't immediately obvious from the code or documentation play an important role in how things will work. All of this is great, but I'd like to argue that we're actually losing something with this as well. There are also many side effects that will happen implicitly that no amount of fancy programming paradigms will get rid of. Your code still takes time to execute. Your code takes electricity. Your code still interacts with the numerous internal systems within your computer. Your code, if it interacts with memory at all, will interact with the CPU's cache, and therefore have a very large impact on the speed and efficiency of not just itself, but many other pieces of your code that may not seem directly related to it at all. That's not even to mention all of the side channel attacks that can allow secure details to be extracted from the side effects your code has on the internal state of your processor. Despite what a lot of programming dogma says, the implementation of code actually can matter a lot. Sure, if you don't care how slow your code runs, or care how much it drains your user's phone or laptop batteries, then great. Black box programming is nice. However, what happens when something goes wrong? What happens when something breaks and you need to go in and fix it? Suddenly, the implementation is the most important factor of all, and that black box becomes a brick wall. When my dad is working on a car, probably the part he struggles the most with, and the part that's making him seriously question now if he wants to keep fixing cars in the future, is dealing with all the computers that have snuck into modern vehicles. If something goes wrong, he has to connect the car to a bunch of additional computers, tools he's not very savvy with, and try to read through the diagnostic codes that the car produces. A wall of text and symbols is very information dense, but it's not something our brains are very well suited to understanding. If a picture says 1,000 words, it does so in a way that can allow you to gain a useful summary, often in just a quick glance. A quick glance at a 1,000-word essay, on the other hand, will provide you with effectively nothing. The way we write even reflects this to some extent. Separating text into paragraphs, or making large, bolded titles for sections of text are simple examples, but perhaps things like code indentation and syntax highlighting would be better examples. It's not much, but moving some of the structure of the text into other domains that the brain can recognize, like shape, color, contrast, and size, can clearly speed up comprehension. When working with at least a well-designed mechanical system, there's a sense in which things often don't have very many side effects. A pair of gears might only grind on each other and turn based on each other's axles. They likely don't interact much with something on the other side of the car. On the other hand, there's a sense in which nearly everything has a side effect. Moving, grinding parts produce noises and heat. Things wear down over time, and that wear can often be visible, or at least affect how the car handles and operates. Of course, while the car is being driven, these side effects might not serve much practical purpose, except perhaps for that one guy who has a very loud car and wants everyone within a 5-mile radius to know that he has a very loud car. Then again, the little details about how the car reacts and responds to the driver's controls may subconsciously inform the driver's decisions. These side effects, however, are very useful when something goes wrong or when something is at risk of going wrong. If the car makes concerning noises when you make a sharp turn in 4-wheel drive, that's perhaps a signal to be a bit more careful in those situations. Or if you're trying to fix a car, your ears are fairly good at triangulating where the noise is coming from, and what kind of noise you hear can even help you track it down even further. This brings me into the neuroscience. The main part of the brain, for most of what we humans like to use ours for, at least when we are using them, is the cerebral cortex. It's the big, wrinkly part. Now, the reason why it's so wrinkled is because the vast majority of the neurons are actually in just the thin outer layer called the neocortex. Underneath the neocortex is primarily tissue that wires each part of the neocortex to each other. That and all of the other subcortical parts of the brain beneath it. The neocortex is often divided into many different specialized parts. The visual cortex is responsible for sight. The auditory cortex is responsible for hearing. The motor cortex controls your muscles. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for abstract reasoning and decision-making. You'd be forgiven for believing that each of these parts of the brain work in completely different ways, but shockingly, they don't. It's long been observed that if you zoom in on any given part of the neocortex, even in every part looks remarkably similar. Each part of the cortex consists of the same 6 to 12 layers, depending on how you're counting. These layers have the same cell types and are connected to each other in the same way, no matter what part of the cortex you're looking at. Together, these circuits form what neuroscientists call a cortical column, a basic general-purpose brain circuit that can learn to see, hear, think, feel pain, control muscles, enjoy music, and every other thing that your cortex does. If evolution needs a smarter animal, it doesn't design some specialized circuit for doing whatever kind of thing the animal's supposed to do. It just copies and pastes these same cortical columns a few extra times. What determines a column's function isn't how it's wired internally, but rather how it's wired to the outside world. Feed in visual information, and it learns to see. Wire it to the spinal cord, and it learns to drive muscles. There are perhaps some distinctions that can be made. Layer 4, the primary input layer of the column, is thicker in sensory regions, for example. Layer 5, the layer that drives outputs of the column, is thicker in the motor cortex. However, these variations don't exist to nearly the same extent in the brains of infants, and seem to mostly just be a product of each column adapting itself to better solve the problem it learns to solve. In hindsight, this perhaps isn't very surprising. The brain is known to be very plastic. It can adapt and change its function quite substantially. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors from 70,000 years ago didn't have smartphones. Evolution didn't give us a smartphone cortex. Despite that, we can use them. The brain can also repurpose itself. After a stroke or some other form of brain damage, other parts of the brain can begin to take over functions that the brain region. After a stroke or some other form of brain damage, other parts of the brain begin taking over the functions of the brain region that was lost. The visual cortex in blind people often learns to read Braille, among other things. However, what many people may struggle to believe is that this can actually be taken much further. Let's talk about sensory substitution and sensory augmentation. There's plenty of hype around Elon Musk's Neuralink company, the one that promises brain implants for the masses to do everything from operate prosthetic limbs to provide conceptual telepathy. There are many people suggesting that we could use this technology to provide ourselves with brand new senses and abilities. The recent game Cyberpunk 2077 even features this as a basic game mechanic, though it of course has been a staple of science fiction for a long time. The thing is, we can do that today. No brain implant required. If you provide a cortical column with visual information, it learns to see. However, what if you have someone who's blind? Can you still get visual information into their brain? It turns out you can. This is called sensory substitution. There's a company called Seeing with Sound that produces a headset for blind people. The headset features a camera, a small computer, and a set of headphones. The camera takes in visual information, albeit at a low frame rate and low resolution, passes it to the computer where it is converted into an audio clip. Bright pixels are loud, dark pixels are quiet. Pixels at the top of the image are high-pitched and at the bottom of the image are low-pitched. Pixels at the right side of the image are played first, and the audio clip pans across the image, playing a continuous sound. An image is taken roughly every second or two, converted to a sound, and then played into the headphones. If any of that sounds confusing, don't fret. They have a YouTube channel where you can compare videos to the images. Go ahead, check out their YouTube channel. Close your eyes and try to figure out what you're looking at. With enough training, you can actually learn to see with your ears. This works with other sensory domains as well. Famous neuroscientist and science communicator David Eagleman has a company called Neosensory, which produces a wristband called the Buzz. It converts audio into vibrations across your wrist, allowing the deaf to hear with their skin. Of course, neither of these provides the same fidelity as the original senses, but the fact that we can do this at all is incredible, especially without any neural implants. It also raises a fascinating question. Why not feed in some data that the brain has no sensory organs for at all? This is called sensory augmentation. Theoretically, if you provide the brain with, say, stock market information, it would learn to sense the stock market. You'd have a stock market cortex. Curiously, we already have such a tool for doing this. Graphs. We convert a table of price data into an image with a particular shape and colored in a certain way, and by looking at it, we can learn to recognize the swings of the market. Data visualization is arguably one of the most powerful tools that we have for understanding a wide variety of different types of information. However, clearly we can experiment with other senses as well. In fact, how is this any different from what my dad does? The internal workings of a car have side effects that produce sounds that can be heard and vibrations that can be felt. These are what allows a skilled mechanic, and to a lesser extent a driver, to feel the internal workings of the vehicle. By learning to recognize the sounds that the engine makes, or how the car handles and vibrates in different situations, anyone can gain a sense of the internals of the vehicle. It's as though you have sensory neurons spread throughout the car, sending signals directly to your brain. You may not even need to know exactly how things work on the inside. You're used to the sounds your car makes and can quickly recognize when it makes a sound that it's not supposed to. You can use some simple cause and effect reasoning and basic intuition to guess as to what you did to cause it, and in many cases, that can be sufficient to avoid doing serious harm to your vehicle. Knowing exactly what each specific sound means and what is really going on with specific parts in the car is really only valuable if you're trying to do more serious work on the internals of the car. Likewise, you probably don't need to know the exact details of exactly which muscles you move and how you move them and how it affects the exact acoustics of your vocal tract when speaking. But meanwhile, a voice expert like, for example, Zia Eros, she may be able to talk your ear off about it in great detail. This is something that programming is seriously lacking. Programming needs sensory substitution. Programming needs side effects, at least optional high bandwidth ones for debugging. Of course, We can talk all day about theory, but what are some things that can actually be done? Where do we even start with this? First off, it would be useful to have a name for whatever this is. What do you call a sensory augmentation tool designed for productivity? I'm just going to coin a name for now: intuition tools. Next, for any kind of software that you're trying to use these tools on, there's likely going to need to be a lot of customization for that program, especially big programs. One program may be very different from the next, and a one-size-fits-all technique is likely to be very limited. There are also a great many cases where the interesting behaviors may not be something easily visible with a given tool. A visualization or auditory representation of control flow may be useful for some common cases, but may break down with some very complex control flow, or where the control flow is encoded more in the data rather than the code. This is common in heavily dynamic or polymorphic code, but also is common in interpreters and emulators. Custom intuition tools for each program may sound daunting, but with how much effort it may save to have these during debugging, it may actually be worth it. That and a few basic tools and techniques that can be combined and pieced together could go a long way. Another approach that should definitely be on people's radars is binary visualization. There's a great Black Hat talk by Greg Conti and Sergey Bradis discussing techniques for looking at raw binary data and figuring out through a variety of simple statistical methods and data visualization techniques exactly what kind of data it is. A simple but very powerful method is to take adjacent bytes in memory and treat them as x and y coordinates, and then plot them in a scatter plot. The result is a visualization technique where some of the implicit structure of data can produce very recognizable patterns. Pixel data creates a very recognizable fuzzy diagonal band across the plot. Audio creates a fuzzy border around the plot. Machine code produces what looks like a plaid pattern. Text produces a distinct set of squares and rectangles in one corner of the plot. Encrypted or compressed data produces static. There's also another great talk I'd recommend looking at by Chris Domas, who takes these ideas further and builds a tool for reverse engineering executable files, even when they use custom formats that standard reverse engineering tools have no way of dealing with, which is a very common tactic used by those who write malware and renders most tooling completely useless. Links to these talks will be in the description for this podcast, wherever that might be, probably YouTube. Of course, debuggers can provide some output. You can set breakpoints in your code and have it stop when it reaches specific places, and then you can print out and inspect specific values of variables. But clearly that doesn't scale. Where are all the debuggers that let you visualize and plot whole data structures? How do you know where to set breakpoints when you don't know what exactly is going wrong in the program and where the problem might be occurring? It seems like our debuggers are stuck in the 1980s when they really should be like Minority Report by now. Imagine having some way to look at a map of your program, each part highlighted based on what kind of activity it's doing. Perhaps there'd even be noises or specific tones played during certain activities. The human brain is very good at anomaly detection and amazing at recognizing when something sounds or looks a bit off. Some of this may even be useful during ordinary development. Imagine an IDE that allows you to convert code into sound. Mouse over a function name, and your IDE plays some combination of noises that your brain can interpret as an encoding of the structure of that function, or at least some properties of that function. It might not be as good as reading through the original code, but it may be a great way to, in just a second or two, get a general gist or intuition of what kind of structure this function has, what kinds of things it might be doing, and whether it's worth your time to look more closely at the code or whether you can just move on to some other thing. Now, I certainly don't have all the answers here, but I'd like to put some ideas into people's heads for what could exist, as well as a little bit about what's been going through my head as I build some of the projects at Badger Labs. I hope that we can learn something valuable from an old man fixing cars. And someday, maybe the software industry will look something like an industry of software mechanics. And that's where I think I'll end this podcast. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you join me next time on the Intersecting Shadows podcast.